welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into a world where ambition and controversy, they kind of collide. It's
Yeah,
the international arms trade.
right.
And our subject is Efraim Diveroli. Now, this is a figure who has sparked, endless debate. Was he a visionary entrepreneur
Yeah.
or just a really good con artist?
Yeah, a really good one.
You've sent us a whole collection of sources,
I have.
articles, court documents,
Yes.
even a peek into Diveroli's own book. So
Yeah.
let's unpack this and see if we can,
Yeah.
separate fact from fiction here.
You know what's fascinating about Diveroli is that his story really gets to the heart of this question. Grifter or gifted. He came of age in a system that's both incredibly complex and full of opportunities,
Yeah.
especially during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
He was barely out of high school when he started making deals that would make, like most seasoned CEOs, just sweat. Born in Miami Beach, Diveroli had a family connection that most teenagers wouldn't even dream of. His uncle was a major player in the arms trade.
That's wow.
It's like something out of a movie.
That family connection is crucial to understanding Diveroli's trajectory.
Mhm.
It gave him an almost insider's perspective on a notoriously opaque industry.
Right.
By the time he was 16, Diveroli had dropped out of high school to work for his uncle, and it became pretty clear that he had a natural talent for this kind of high-stakes dealing.
So he's a high school dropout making deals in the international arms trade. That's not your typical teenage rebellion. But Diveroli didn't stop there.
No.
At just 19, he decided to go solo and founded AEY Inc.
And this is where we start to see the ambition that really defined Diveroli. He wasn't content with just working for his uncle. He wanted to build his own empire. And the timing, in some ways, couldn't have been better. The demand for weapons in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, it had created a huge market. And Diveroli was incredibly savvy about exploiting the opportunities that emerged.
This is where the story takes a turn from interesting to, well,
Oh, yeah.
kind of unbelievable. Diveroli's strategy involved underbidding his competitors by ridiculous margins, sometimes offering prices that seemed almost impossible.
Yeah.
How did he manage that?
Diveroli understood that the government often prioritized, speed and cost effectiveness, especially in wartime. He was a master at navigating the complexities of government contracts and finding loopholes that others just missed.
Wow.
He was also willing to operate in the so-called gray market, the unregulated spaces of the arms trade, which allowed him to access cheaper weapons and ammunition.
So he's operating in this legal gray area, undercutting everyone else and somehow winning these huge government contracts. What were some of AEY's early wins?
AEY started relatively small, securing contracts to supply things like helmets and ammunition to the U.S. military. But they quickly moved up the ladder, eventually winning a contract to supply FN Herstal machine guns to the Colombian army. These are serious weapons. And it shows how rapidly AEY was gaining traction in the industry.
Okay, so we've got a young, ambitious entrepreneur who's playing by his own rules and racking up these impressive wins. It's almost like a classic underdog story.
Yeah,
But we know there's a darker side to this tale.
right.
What was the turning point?
In 2007, AEY landed a massive $300 million contract to supply ammunition to Afghan forces. This was the deal that would put Diveroli on the map, but also ultimately lead to his downfall. The contract stipulated that the ammunition had to be serviceable, a term that has a very specific meaning in military contracts.
Let's break that down for our listeners. What does serviceable ammunition actually mean? And why
Yeah.
was it such a crucial detail in this particular contract?
Serviceable means that the ammunition must meet certain quality standards to ensure that it functions reliably and safely. This is especially important, in a war zone where malfunctioning ammunition could have just disastrous consequences for soldiers on the ground.
So it's not just about delivering any old bullets.
Yeah.
It's about ensuring that those bullets meet specific military standards for safety and reliability.
Right.
What did Diveroli do to fulfill this contract?
This is where the story takes a controversial turn. To meet the demands of the contract and maintain his incredibly low bids, Diveroli turned to a source that raised red flags: decades-old Chinese ammunition stockpiles. left over from the Cold War.
Wait a minute. Chinese ammunition, wasn't there a U.S. embargo against Chinese arms at the time?
There was, and this is the heart of the scandal that would eventually bring Diveroli down. AEY was caught repackaging this aging Chinese ammunition, violating the embargo to fulfill their lucrative Pentagon contract. And this wasn't just a minor oversight. The ammunition was reportedly in terrible condition, some of it corroded, potentially dangerous.
So not only was he cutting corners to make a profit,
Right.
but he was also potentially putting lives at risk by supplying substandard ammunition. This is where the visionary entrepreneur narrative starts to crumble, doesn't it?
It certainly raises serious questions about Diveroli's ethical boundaries and his willingness to prioritize profit over safety and compliance.
Right.
And the scandal, once it broke, had a ripple effect that went far beyond AEY.
Right.
It sparked a major investigation by the House Oversight Committee
Oh.
and cast a spotlight on the sometimes murky world of government contracting.
This is where things get even more complex, right? It wasn't just Diveroli running this show. He had partners, employees, a whole network of people
Right.
involved in AEY's operations. Let's talk about David Pacus,
Okay.
Diveroli's childhood friend and business partner.
Yeah.
What role did he play in all of this?
Pacus's role in AEY is really interesting because it provides a different perspective on how Diveroli operated. Pacus was a licensed massage therapist before he joined AEY, like about as far from the world of arms dealing as you can imagine.
So how does a massage therapist end up as the right-hand man to an international arms dealer? That's quite a career shift.
According to Pacus, he was drawn in by Diveroli's charisma and the allure of making big money quickly.
Right.
He claims that he was initially unaware of the extent of Diveroli's shady dealings and that he was essentially manipulated into participating in illegal activities.
So he's painting himself as the naive, innocent party.
Right.
Caught up in Diveroli's web of deceit.
Yeah.
Is there any truth to that?
It's hard to say for sure. Pacus did eventually plead guilty to conspiracy to defraud the government and was sentenced to 7 months of house arrest.
Wow.
So while he might not have been the mastermind behind AEY's operations, he was definitely more than just a passive bystander.
It seems like a classic case of turning a blind eye to questionable practices until it's too late.
Right.
But let's be honest. A $300 million contract probably makes it easier to ignore those nagging doubts.
There's no question that the potential for huge profits played a role in AEY's willingness to push the boundaries of legality, but it's also important to remember that this was happening against the backdrop of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. There was a sense of urgency and need to supply the troops quickly, and that sometimes led to corners being cut.
So Diveroli was exploiting a system that was already under immense strain. He was able to capitalize on those weaknesses to secure contracts that might not have been available under normal circumstances. It's a reminder that even in highly regulated systems, there are always vulnerabilities that someone like Diveroli can find and exploit.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the question of government oversight. Some argue that the agencies responsible for vetting contractors were simply too lax, overwhelmed by the demands of wartime procurement. Others contend that Diveroli was exceptionally cunning, able to manipulate the system and create a facade of legitimacy that masked his true intentions.
It's a chicken or the egg scenario.
Yeah.
Was the system inherently flawed, or was Diveroli simply a master manipulator?
It's likely a combination of both. There's no question that Diveroli had a talent for exploiting loopholes and presenting himself in a way that inspired confidence. But there were also clear gaps in the government's vetting procedures, gaps that allowed AEY to secure contracts despite some pretty obvious red flags.
One of those red flags, as we discovered while going through these sources, has to do with AEY's claim to be a small, disadvantaged business.
Okay.
Can you unpack that for us? What does that even mean in the context of the arms trade?
The U.S. government has programs designed to support businesses owned by minorities or those considered economically disadvantaged. These programs offer certain advantages, like set-asides where specific contracts are reserved for these businesses. It's meant to level the playing field and promote diversity in government contracting.
So Diveroli claimed that AEY fit that description to gain a competitive edge.
That's what the evidence suggests. In 2005, AEY received a designation as a small, disadvantaged business, which allowed them to bid on contracts specifically set aside for such companies.
But was this designation legitimate? Was AEY actually a small, disadvantaged business?
That's where things get murky. A subsequent investigation by the House Oversight Committee found no record of AEY's certification as a disadvantaged business. It seems likely that Diveroli fabricated this status to access contracts that would have otherwise been out of reach.
So not only was he operating in this legal gray area with the gray market deals,
Right.
but he was potentially flat out lying about his company's status to gain an unfair advantage. It's another layer of deception that makes you question how much of Diveroli's success was built on legitimate business acumen and how much was simply smoke and mirrors.
It's a pattern that emerges throughout Diveroli's story. A blend of ambition, risk-taking, and a willingness to bend or even break the rules to get what he wanted. It's part of what makes his story so captivating, but it also raises some pretty serious ethical concerns.
It seems like a classic example of someone getting caught up in the game,
Yeah.
driven by the allure of money and power to the point where they lose sight of the bigger picture.
And it's a reminder that even in a field as seemingly removed from everyday life as the international arms trade, there are human consequences to these actions. We're not just talking about abstract contracts and financial transactions. We're talking about weapons that can have a real impact on people's lives.
We've talked a lot about Diveroli and his role in AEY, but there's another key player in this story who operates in a much more shadowy realm.
Right.
Heinrich Thomet, the Swiss arms dealer. What can you tell us about him and his connection to Diveroli?
Thomet is almost a mythical figure in the world of arms dealing, known for his ability to procure hard-to-find weapons and ammunition, often operating in countries with lax export controls or those facing international sanctions.
He's the guy you call when you need something that's not exactly on the approved list, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Diveroli recognized the value of having someone like Thomet in his network.
Right.
Thomet's expertise and connections allowed AEY to bid on contracts that required specialized knowledge or access to weapon systems that were difficult to obtain through legitimate channels.
So their partnership was mutually beneficial. Diveroli got access to Thomet's shady but valuable network, and Thomet, I'm assuming, got a cut of the profits from AEY's successful bids.
That's the likely scenario. But their relationship was built on a foundation of secrecy. And as is often the case in these kinds of arrangements, it ultimately contributed to AEY's downfall.
It sounds like a classic case of a deal with the devil, where the short-term gains are outweighed by the long-term risks.
And it highlights the dangers of operating in the shadows, where trust is fragile and loyalty can be fleeting. When the scandal broke, Thomet quickly distanced himself from Diveroli and AEY, leaving the young arms dealer to face the consequences alone.
It's a reminder that in the world of international arms dealing, there's not a lot of room for sentimentality or loyalty.
No.
It's a business driven by profit and self-preservation.
Yeah.
And when things go wrong, everyone looks out for themselves.
Exactly. And that brings us back to Diveroli and Pacuz, who were also facing serious legal trouble as the investigation into AEY intensified. Pacuz, as we mentioned earlier, ultimately decided to cooperate with the government, hoping to reduce his own sentence.
So he turned on his childhood friend to save his own skin.
Yeah.
That doesn't exactly speak well of their relationship, does it?
It's certainly a betrayal of trust, and it adds another layer of complexity to the story. But it also highlights the immense pressure that both men were under as the walls were closing in.
They were facing serious prison time.
Yeah.
Their reputations were in tatters.
Right.
They were being scrutinized by the media and the government.
Yeah.
It's a situation that would test even the strongest of bonds.
And it ultimately reveals something fundamental about Diveroli's character, his ability to compartmentalize,
Right.
to distance himself from the human consequences of his actions.
It's as if he was so focused on the game,
Yeah.
on winning at all costs, that he lost sight of the human beings who were impacted by his decisions.
That's a key insight, and it leads us to another crucial aspect of Diveroli's story, the role of government oversight in both enabling his rise and ultimately contributing to his downfall.
We touched on this earlier, but it's worth revisiting in light of what we've learned about Diveroli's tactics and his network.
Yeah.
How did someone like Diveroli, with his questionable methods and associations, manage to secure such lucrative government contracts in the first place?
There's a fascinating paradox at play here. On the one hand, as we've discussed, Diveroli exploited loopholes in government contracting procedures, potentially taking advantage of lax oversight during a time of war when the need for speed sometimes trumped due diligence.
He was able to slip through the cracks of a system that was strained by the demands of wartime procurement.
But on the other hand, Diveroli's downfall was in part due to government intervention. specifically the actions of Senator Carl Levin, then chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, who took a particular interest in AEY's $300 million contract.
So Diveroli benefited from a system that was perhaps too trusting in some ways, but he was also ultimately brought down by that same system when it finally turned its attention to his wrongdoing.
It's a reminder that power is a double-edged sword.
Right.
Diveroli wielded it effectively for a time, manipulating systems and bending rules to his advantage. But ultimately that power shifted, and he found himself on the receiving end of its force.
It's a classic case of what goes around comes around. Diveroli's ambition led him to dance on the edge of legality, and when he stumbled, the full force of government scrutiny came crashing down on him.
And it highlights the importance of having strong oversight mechanisms in place. Individuals like Senator Levin who are willing to challenge the status quo and ensure that government agencies are fulfilling their responsibilities.
It's also a reminder that no one, not even a cunning arms dealer like Efraim Diveroli, is above the law.
Exactly. And as we move towards the final part of our deep dive, I think it's crucial to consider the broader implications of Diveroli's story.
Right.
We focused a lot on the legal and ethical dimensions, but there's another layer to the story that we haven't fully explored yet. The human cost of the arms trade.
That's a really important point. We can't lose sight of the fact that these aren't just abstract business deals. They involve real weapons that are used in real conflicts with real consequences for people's lives.
We're talking about tools of destruction that can cause immense suffering. And it's essential to acknowledge that even those who operate in the seemingly distant world of international arms dealing have a moral responsibility to consider the potential consequences of their actions.
It's a sobering thought,
Yeah.
and one that should inform our final analysis of Diveroli's legacy. So we've spent a lot of time kind of unpacking the complexities of Efraim Diveroli's story.
Yeah.
You know, his rise to power, his questionable tactics, and the network of individuals who both enabled him
Right.
and ultimately betrayed him.
Yeah.
But as we move towards our final thoughts here,
Yeah.
I want to circle back to that central question we posed at the beginning.
Right.
Grifter
Yeah.
or gifted.
Right.
What's your assessment after diving deep into all of these sources?
It's a question that continues to spark debate, and I think that's a testament to the enigmatic nature of Diveroli himself.
Right.
You know, he was clearly a brilliant businessman, able to grasp complex systems and exploit them to his advantage.
Right.
He had an undeniable charisma
Yeah.
and a relentless drive that propelled him to success at an age when most people are still figuring out their career paths.
He was a master manipulator, a chess player in a world of checkers.
Right.
But that manipulation came at a cost,
Absolutely.
didn't it?
Diveroli's ambition ultimately led him to cross ethical and legal boundaries.
Right.
And that's where the gifted label starts to kind of lose its shine.
Yeah.
You know, his willingness to cut corners, to prioritize profit over safety and compliance ultimately led to his downfall.
His story is a cautionary tale about the seductive power of ambition
Yeah.
and the importance of tempering that ambition with a strong moral compass.
Right.
It's a reminder that success achieved through deception and exploitation
Yeah.
is ultimately hollow
Right.
and unsustainable.
And it highlights the need for greater transparency and accountability
Yeah.
in systems of power,
Right.
whether it's government contracting or any other field where the potential for abuse exists.
Right.
You know, we need mechanisms in place to ensure that individuals like Diveroli can't operate with impunity, that they're held responsible for their actions.
We've explored the systemic factors that allowed Diveroli to thrive,
Right.
the gaps in oversight, the pressures of wartime procurement.
Right.
But we also have to acknowledge the role of individual responsibility.
Right.
Diveroli made choices,
Yeah.
conscious decisions to deceive and exploit.
Right.
And those choices had consequences.
Yes.
Not just for himself,
Yeah.
but for others as well.
That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
We can't simply dismiss Diveroli's actions as a product of the system. He
Right.
had agency, he made choices, and those choices reflect a certain moral calculus,
Right.
a prioritization of self-interest over the well-being of others.
And those choices ultimately led to his downfall. He may have been a brilliant tactician, but he lacked the foresight to see that his house of cards was built on a foundation of deception,
Right.
and that eventually it would crumble.
His story serves as a potent reminder that success achieved through ethical shortcuts
Right.
is often fleeting and ultimately self-defeating.
Yeah.
It's a lesson that resonates far beyond the world of arms dealing.
Right.
A lesson that applies to any individual or organization that seeks to achieve its goals through manipulation and exploitation.
So where do we land on the question of grifter or gifted?
Hmm.
Is it possible to be both?
I think Diveroli embodies that duality.
Yeah.
He possessed undeniable talents, a sharp mind, and ability to navigate complex systems.
Right.
But those talents were ultimately overshadowed by his willingness to engage in unethical and illegal activities.
He was a brilliant but flawed individual.
Yeah.
A cautionary tale about the perils of unchecked ambition and the importance of grounding success in ethical principles. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the systems we create and the individuals who are willing to exploit them for personal gain.
And it challenges us to think critically about the choices we make,
Yeah.
the values we prioritize, and the kind of legacy we want to leave behind in a world where charisma and controversy collide.
Yeah.
It's essential to look beyond the surface, to examine the motives and actions of those who claim to be visionaries.
Right.
Only then can we truly discern who is genuinely changing the world and who is simply lining their own pockets.
It's a deep dive that leaves us with more questions than answers.
Yeah.
But perhaps that's the point. It's a journey that compels us to keep exploring,
Yes.
keep questioning,
Keep diving.
and keep striving for a world where success is defined not by profit alone,
Right.
but by the ethical principles that guide our actions.
Well said.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll be back next time with another compelling story of an individual who's blurred the lines between visionary
Right.
and villain.
Yes.
Until then, keep diving, keep questioning, and keep seeking the truth behind the headlines.